We can find instant satisfaction in almost anything these days. Sleepy? Instant coffee. Need to sell your car fast? Car sales, instant offer. That's right, sell your car the instant way and get it done with Australia's most trusted site for cars.
The grand final, Victoria folded its tent yesterday. It has felt inevitable for some time. The Minister in charge, the Minister of Sport, Martin Pakula. Minister, welcome back to the program.
Good morning, Jared.
Could you have imagined when you had to release last year's grand final that's as good as 12 months on, you'd be doing the same again?
No, I didn't think that would happen. And 2021 has, I think there's been a bit of optimism bias about COVID all over the world now for a year or so. And 2021's proven to be much more challenging with COVID than I think anybody thought it would be. And the risk is that we're all very optimistic about 2022. I think this time around, with vaccination numbers starting to really motor, we've got more grounds for optimism. But it's been a long 18 months.
So there's been sense of doom about the grand final, given we haven't had a crowd in Victoria since round 17. How far back did you realise that realistically it just couldn't happen?
Oh, look, I was holding out. I was holding out hope probably till a few days ago. I still thought when we were at 20 or 30 cases a day that we could drive it down to zero and get a game away. But the last few days and the realisation that the current restrictions would be extended, that really was the end of the penny section, and we got into serious discussions with the AFL over the last few days. I got asked at the presser yesterday why we waited until yesterday, and it was just that sense of trying to hold out for as long as possible. But in the end, it just wasn't.
What was the most adventurous plan that you had in the drawer?
Oh, look, we looked at everything, up to and including this idea of, only letting vaccinated people into the ground. But we're just not at that point, and we talked to the Public Health Department or the Public Health Unit of the Department of Health about that. We're in an environment where we've still got relatively low vaccination numbers in the community generally, and vaccinated people can catch it and vaccinated people can transmit. And it's why, you didn't see a vax-only model at the Olympic Games, and you haven't seen it in other parts of Australia yet. I think the time will come for that, but we're not at that point yet. It'll particularly be, I think, the case when we've got the technology to allow, what's happening in France, for example, where you can scan your vaccine passport in. So I think, there's a lot of support in the community, I think, and amongst organisations for having events and environments where only vaccinated people can attend. And I think that might well be a feature of lots of our lives in 2022.
So would it be reasonable to extrapolate that the next serious sporting crowd in Melbourne, whenever that is a vaccine passport crowd?
Not necessarily. If we've got high vaccination rates and relatively low cases later in the year, then I think we'll potentially have crowds without necessary vaccine passport. But every day that goes by, we're getting closer to that. I know the Commonwealth are working on the technology, and I think the will exists from all sorts of sporting codes, not just sporting codes though, like the hospitality sector, restaurants and pubs. People want to get back to normal living or something as close to normal living as we can. And I think vax passports are absolutely going to be one of the tools in our drawer for that.
So just the picture of our sporting capital, Minister. So 2 grand finals, 2 GPs, Bells, a spectator-free Melbourne Cup, and a bit unclear as to what happens this time around. How damaging is it to our sporting capital to have these events erased from our calendar?
Well, it's bloody hard. And as major events minister, the last thing you want to do is either see events not proceed or send them elsewhere. But unfortunately, that's just part of the reality of living in a global pandemic. And, some parts of the year, like Anzac Day, circumstances allow you to have big events, and other parts of the year, they're unable to proceed. I mean, we've seen it all over the world. We've seen it all over Australia. I think Brisbane had to cancel the Ekka, and Royal Adelaide show's gone. And I don't think the NRL Grand Final will happen in Sydney. I think we'll wait for the NRL to make an announcement of that, but I'll be very surprised. None of these things are gone permanently, Jared. That's the important thing. The F1 will be back. The AO will be here next year. We'll get back to the Melbourne Cup with crowds, whether that's this year or next. The AFL Grand Final will be back. So I would rather think of it as it's a temporary wound to our collective sporting soul, but it's not permanent. And we'll have these events because we're a sports loving city, because we put them on really well. And because people love to come here. So none of those fundamentals have changed. It's just that we've been through a shitty couple of years.
Yep, that's the absolute truth. It's the beautiful first day of spring doesn't quench the mood of the one with spring in the air. How I spoke to Giles Thompson yesterday, and there was just a tone of pessimism to his voice. How challenging is it for anybody to get to the feature days of the races, do you think, from here?
Look, it's not going to be easy. I'm meeting with the Metro Friday. And you probably recall last year I pushed very hard, too hard, as it turned out, for some crowds back at the races by Cox Plate Day, and I think the community made it clear that they expected the racing industry to be as responsible in a public health sense as everybody else. Fantastic. From a public health point of view, we'll have crowds back at the races if it's safe to do so. If the public health, every race go, every punter, the sooner we're all vaccinated, the sooner we'll be able to get back to these events. So, I'm hopeful that with our numbers down and our numbers up, but as we sit here on September 1, who knows what things will look like in mid-October or early November.
Do you have a runway to get a crowd to a Melbourne Cup?
You don't need a huge runway. You'd need a runway, obviously, if you want to put up all of the infrastructure for a bird cage or the other entertainment zones at Flemington. But generally, to just if you wanted to agree on crowd numbers and have people in grandstands, you don't need a huge runway for that. A week or two is plenty, I think. So that's the sort of thing I'll talk to the clubs about today. The sorts of crowds and the sorts of numbers and the sorts of infrastructure dictate the runway. But you can have a smaller crowd in designated seats with a pretty short period of time. A pretty short lead up.
If modelling is that we might have 80% vaccination by mid-November, and you correct me if that's not quite where we're projecting, what are the possibilities then for Boxing Day, which would be another 6 weeks beyond potentially the 80% marker?
Yeah, well, look, that's again, it's hard for me to be definitive about what sort of numbers we. If we're vaccinated, that it's really later in the year that we start to have those discussions with the public health team about how relaxed they feel about particularly outdoor public events with high vaccination rates. It's really that intersection between what's your vaccination number and what's your case number, and right now. We're more focused on what do we need to get industry back, to get our personal freedoms back, and all of those things. What those sort of things mean for public events, it's an ongoing dialogue with Department of Health. But I think if we've got high vaccination rates, then I'm very confident we'll be able to have crowds at Boxing Day. How big they are will really depend on the circumstances at the time. But look, we had I think 30,000 crowds for Boxing Day last year, and it didn't mean that everybody who wanted to go to the cricket could go, but I was there on day one, I think, and the atmosphere was terrific. So now this is Ashes, so the clamour for tickets will be enormous. All I can say, Jared, is that the higher the vax uptake, the better chance we've got.
Yeah. And on that front, as I'm not sure whether you've seen it, but Andy Murray at the US Open yesterday was really firm with the tennis fraternity that they needed to get vaccinated, and he was specific around the Australian Open and the possibilities if the entire fraternity was. It did sort of beg the question, is will there be a requirement for the tennis fraternity to be vaccinated to come for the Australian Open?
Well, let me be really clear. I'm with Andy. Whether or not there'll be a requirement, in other words, whether or not it's as strict as you won't get into Australia if you're not vaccinated, that I don't know. What I'm very, very clear on, what I'm very sure about, is that the rules for unvaccinated players and the rules for vaccinated players, I'm quite confident will be very different. So we'll provide clarity to the ATP and the WTA very, very shortly. But I think they can be very confident that being vaccinated will be a very wise thing for them to do before they seek to come to Australia.
Do you feel certain that the Australian Open will go ahead as scheduled?
It's hard to be certain about anything right now, Jared, but I'm very confident that the Australian Open will go ahead. On our vaccine horizon, second half of January, we should be in a very good position, and I think we're in. We were able to get the tournament away last year, and we'll be in, and that was with 0% of the community vax. We're at 80% plus, be in a much better position. So I'm very confident the Australian Open will go ahead, and it's very important that it does.
Minister, appreciate your time. Thank you.
Good on you, Jared.
We can find instant satisfaction in almost anything these days. Sleepy? Instant coffee. Need to sell your car fast? Car sales, instant offer. That's right. Sell your car the instant way and get it done with Australia's most trusted site for cars.